From the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right, just about 5 minutes after 10 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. One of the subjects that always gets the phone ringing because people don't agree is the subject of energy, what they call fossil fuels, the oils, right? The extracted oils from the ground, whether they're drilled the old-fashioned way or fracked, and then I've even heard that we've always fracked. I don't really know. And then we've heard from those who say, you know, we need to have other sources of energy. The subject that comes up quite frequently, in fact, it's in the news just this past week, is that Disney has been able to put in so many solar cells that they'll be able to run 2 of their 4 theme parks completely off of the energy created by those solar cells. Well, that's a good idea, but to say we can do that with New York City or with a big city, is that possible? I think the acreage necessary for Disney is 1/3 the size of the whole thing, of the 2 parks combined. Wow. So that would be 1/3 the size, and they don't have multiple story buildings. There's so many things that they don't have. It's a theme park. You know, so I don't know, but maybe we're heading that way. Maybe things are looking good. The one thing I will say, I think is the smart thing to do, and I don't think anybody disagrees with this, is we need to be good stewards of the planet, right? Mm-hmm. But do we do that at the expense of what we have going for us? Do we do like Europe has done and say no more drilling and then go ahead and take oil from Russia, which is drilling? You know? Yeah. So what's the difference? If you're using it, you're using it. If it's on the planet, it's affecting the planet. It doesn't have to be in your own backyard, right? Mm-hmm. Jack Kerfoot is on the phone. He is listening to me. He might have disagreed with everything I just said. I don't know, but he's an expert on this subject way more than I'll ever be. And he's written a book called Fueling America, An Insider's Journey, Robin? An Insider's Journey. Jack is a scientist, and that's what we need. He's the geophysicist, and he's on the phone to talk to us about his book called Fueling America, as well as the Green New Deal, which I looked at, and there's a lot of problems I have with that thing, too. Jack Kerfoot. Good morning, Jack. How you doing?
Larry and Robin, I'm fine. It's a pleasure to be on your show today.
Yeah, it's an honor. Thank you so much. Where are you? Where are you calling from?
Calling from Portland, Oregon.
All right. How's Oregon today? That's where my brother lives.
Well, actually, today we've got snow in Portland. I'm up here on the Portland Heights, elevation about 1,000 feet, so I've got about an inch of snow outside my house.
Oh, I'll have to call my brother later on, ask him about the snow. Right? All right, so tell me what your thoughts are on, well, let's talk about just fuel in general. Are we running out? Are we doing the right thing or the wrong thing? What do you think?
Well, the last energy bill that was passed, bipartisan bill that was passed, is 2005, signed by George W. Bush. And at that time, in 2005, we generated credits, tax credits for fossil fuels, nuclear, and renewable energy. And in 2005, 51% of our power was from coal. Today, it's 29%, and we've seen renewables grow from 4 or 5%, predominantly hydropower, up to 17%, and is projected right now to be up to 30% by 2030. The biggest driver for the move to renewable energy right now is economics. We can generate electricity now on a levelized study, which simply means taking out all incentives, tax credits, and from a levelized study, evaluating typical costs for wind, solar, oil, natural gas, coal, nuclear, and say that the cheapest fuel right now is wind at about 5.2 cents per kilowatt hour. Coal is around 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and the average price for electricity in the U.S. is 12 cents a kilowatt hour. Nuclear is more expensive. So from an economic standpoint, the move to renewables makes wonderful sense. And I think even climate skeptics will say that we know that there is pollution from the emission of gases in the air. If you've ever been to Houston or Los Angeles or Denver, you can see and actually smell the pollution. if you've ever been to China, I lived in Southeast Asia for 11 years, and if you've ever been to China on this type of time of year, you can't even see. You can stick your hand out in front of your face, and you cannot even see your hand because the smog is so intense. So it's now to a toxic level from that standpoint. So from that standpoint, the move to renewables, I'm a proponent for that, for economic reasons and for air quality reasons and environmental reasons. But the new Green Deal, now that's a very different story. I think the short answer would be it would result in chaos and economic disaster.
Because why?
All right. First of all, their plan calls down closing down all fossil fuel plants and nuclear plants in the U.S. in 10 years, and that would represent 83% of our power sources right now. And it's an unrealistic time frame to basically go in and replace all of these plants and build these new wind farms. So we have to realize a nuclear plant might generate 2,000, 3,000, 3,500 megawatts, whereas a typical wind farm might be 1,500, 2,000 megawatts. So it's going to take a lot more of these facilities to make up for the larger power plants. The other factor is we just can't throw a dart on a map and say we're going to build a wind farm here or we're going to build a solar park here. It takes time. You have to evaluate the sites to make sure everything is correct, and then you have to access the land. So I've studied different countries around the world that have tried to move too quickly to from fossil fuel to renewables. And there's a classic case in Australia, specifically the state of South Australia, which tried to go from 40% renewables to 100% renewables in 5 years. They didn't plan their move, and they didn't have battery storage. So when the winds didn't blow and the sun went down at night, 3 million residents had no power. And on top of that, their electricity costs skyrocketed and went up about 500%. And I saw a similar situation in the province of Ottawa. So poorly planned programs, like any energy program or any project, will result in catastrophe if it's not properly done.
Let me ask you this. If wind is the best source for energy, but the problem is we can't do it overnight, if there was a reasonable time frame, do you think that would be ultimately the direction we should go? Like let's say we were to say within 50 years or even 100 years, we should have all of our energy produced by wind sources. Would that be reasonable, and would that be smart?
Well, the answer would be, unfortunately, the environments that we have across the United States vary. In the Great Plains states have been making a dramatic move to wind since 2005. In fact, Texas now is the largest producer of wind energy in the United States. About 15% of their total power is just wind. But if we go to other areas, let's say like in the southeast, where you are, you do have an abundance of solar, but your winds are not consistent or strong enough. So there may be a few places from that standpoint.
Okay.
So if the thing I would say is that's where nuclear may come in. I know there are opponents to nuclear, but they have no greenhouse gases. So you're going to more than likely have to rely, particularly in regions in the southeast, on alternative other sources of energy than wind or certainly solar.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, and I just wanted to slip something in here. I don't want to shift the conversation unless you do,
sure,
to talking about global warming. But the one thing I've always said, when I have two guests who disagree with the global warming thing, I will always say, well, don't you both agree that what we're doing right now is making the air dirtier? And yeah, they do. They both agree with that. They just don't agree with that it's making the earth warmer. And so I would say, well, it sounds like the solution to cleaning the air would solve the global warming problem for the guy who thinks that is the problem, and it would just clean the air for the other guy, because we all want clean air.
Larry, you're 100% right. What I like to say is don't study for the wrong test. And debating climate change, you're unlikely to change either the advocate or the opponent of climate change.
Right.
And so the question I ask him is, well, do you like to save money? And if you like to save money, the move to renewables is a positive factor. And if you like clean air to breathe, then that's a positive factor. So the move to renewables makes logical sense whether you believe in climate change or you don't.
Right now, you are becoming my favorite guest about this subject. All right. So I have a question for you about the actual windmill.
Right.
It seems like it's made from plastic, and if it is, wouldn't we still need to be drilling for oil just so we can make plastic products?
Well, what you're really asking is how dependent are we on oil? And right now, 80% of the oil that we use is for transportation, for planes, for trains, for cars, right? But what people don't understand is we use plastic in the synthetics and the clothing that we wear. We use it in contact lenses. We use it in all the plastics, anything with a wax base, with medicines. So my comment would be there's a finite amount of oil. I mean, oil is not a renewable resource, nor is natural gas, nor is coal. So conservation is going to be very important, and we're going to have to start looking for alternatives to for what we use oil right now. And people really don't realize the number of resources, including medicines. Toothpaste, in fact, does even have a hydrocarbon base to it.
So we would still need to drill. We just wouldn't be using that drill to drive our car. I mean that oil, not that drill.
That's exactly right.
And when you brought up nuclear energy, we still have to have an outside source because we have areas right here in our community in North Central Florida where the electric cars plug themselves in to recharge. And that has to come from somewhere.
Well, that's right. And the new Green Deal doesn't understand the challenge. What I find ironic is New York is, I think, maybe 5 or 6% renewable energy right now. Florida, your state, uses natural gas for 70% of their power, coal for 13%, nuclear power 14%, and renewables about 3%. Now, the good news is you really are making tremendous headway in the development of your solar. And your local, one of your utilities there, used to be Florida Lighting and Power, is now recognized as a real leader in the development of solar parks, utility-scale solar parks, and wind farms. And in fact, they're partnering with the utility we have up in Oregon to build a hybrid park, which is both solar and wind, and they'll generate 350 megawatts of power once the project is completed. But our local utility had to go to your utility for the expertise to get this developed.
Nice.
I don't know which of the two Disney parks will be powered by the solar cells that they built down there. But I looked at I think the biggest one is the Animal Kingdom. So if you took the biggest one and the second biggest one, the numbers of acres that are being powered are about 3 times the size of the area where the solar cells are.
Yes.
So it's a large area of land that's going to power. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to say we don't use outside energy at all, but it's a theme park. And this has come up before where people will say, why don't we do that with cities? And it sounds like a good idea, but then using New York City, for example, which has 100-story buildings, not just 2-story buildings.
Right.
I mean, you would have to have solar cells over the entire island of Staten Island, let's say, and it probably still wouldn't fuel all of Manhattan Island.
Well, I think what you would now, there's some new technology that's been out for a couple of years, and they're starting to develop it. And basically, there's solar cells in the window glass for office buildings. And that has some real power. They are estimating that can cut the energy consumption in these office buildings as much as 40%. But you're right. The issue with solar parks is the fact that it takes space. And in fact, many solar parks that have been proposed in different areas in the U.S. have been blocked by conservation groups that say you're taking up too much green space. So it's that balance along the way. Now, the thing in the East Coast that's starting to take off is offshore wind farms. And Europe has been developing offshore wind farms over the past decade. The first one in the U.S. began off of Rhode Island in 2016. And particularly in the Northeast, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, in that area, but also even off of Cleveland, Ohio, in the Great Lakes, they're looking at offshore wind as an area of major source of power. These large offshore wind farms, although the individual turbine itself isn't very large, but the collection of these can generate 2,000 up to 3,000 megawatts of power, which is comparable to a major reactor.
Are there some military vessels that operate on solar power?
I believe that some of them do use solar. I don't know the specifics of that. I think you'll find that the U.S. military is very aware of climate change because as we see a steady, slow increase of the sea level, obviously impacts their operations and their have contingency. I do know they do have contingency plans for increasing sea level and how they adjust relative to the bases that they have around the world. So what you typically find is our U.S. military, fully support them, are at the cutting edge of technology when it comes to renewables and all sciences.
Can I ask you a question that applies to the geophysicist part of you?
Sure.
There was a story this morning that NASA says that ice shelf down in Antarctica is ready to break off any moment. What will that cause? Will that make the seas rise, as they say, or what is your thought on that?
Well, actually, interestingly enough, I just a few weeks ago I came back from a cruise and a visit down to Antarctica. I wanted to sort of see it myself. There is what you can see from the satellite photos and what you can see in over a period of time is the amount of ice in Antarctica around the world has been reducing. And so the real question is, as the ice melts, what will be the impact on the oceans around us? Will we see a sea level rise? In theory, well, you would think it's logical to say, yes, you would, but how much, that's somewhat of a debatable action. As the ice melts and let's say the iceberg, it breaks off into the water, there's usually a rebound of the Earth as well. In other words, it's been compressed by the heavy ice, and when the ice and the weight is removed, then the Earth restores itself to a degree, and there's a slight increase in elevation. But how much? I don't know. We have to realize science is not exact. I smile a bit when I see people saying, well, the science says. Well, science is based on models. I mean, outside of the law of gravity, we're basically model-driven, and we're constantly testing our theories.
Right.
And you've worked with different people around the world on various energy projects. Have they all come to the same conclusion as you, and everybody's willing to work together?
You put 10 people in a room and you try and solve a problem, there is always a challenge on that. For instance, the Paris Accord, the challenge with the Paris Accord is the commitment to get countries to meet these targets. And then, unfortunately, you do have people that say they're meeting a certain target, but when they've gone in and checked the air quality, they found out that they really aren't. And then another factor is to get people on board. A lot of it has required to be the developed countries to subsidize the development of renewable energy projects in developing countries. And in some of those, the selection has been less than optimum and corruption has come in. So the answer to your question is there is still a dispute on what is the best path forward. And then you have some fantastic projects that are being built in China, less than, let's say, ideally implemented. For instance, they built, I believe, the world's largest wind farm out in a desert area. But they only put enough power lines to get about 10% of the power to where the population centers were. So there are a lot of projects out here that they're being put in place. Some are really making an impact, and you can see the difference in the air quality, and you can see them moving away from coal. But others haven't been thought out as clearly and have been not delivered the results you'd like to see.
Getting back to the Green New Deal, now your credentials say scientist and geophysicist. It doesn't say economist, and I'm not an economist either. But one of the questions we had when we read the Green New Deal, and Rob and I read the whole thing on the air. A lot of it we had problems with that we could comment on. But the economics, I had an issue, or not an issue because I don't know enough, but a question about. And it was regarding making the corporations pay. And I was thinking, well, if you make the corporations pay, they're just going to move to another country. They're not going to stick around. And if you want to build fuel-efficient cars, I think the best thing to do instead of punishing the corporations would be to actually incentivize and give them an incentive to build fuel-efficient cars. And maybe I'm talking a little bit out of your realm of expertise, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, working in the energy industry, if you have to be really well-grounded in economics and economic analysis, and yet have to understand what makes economic sense and what the biggest impact is, and get the bang for the buck, as you would say. So my answer, first of all, let's take a look at the new Green Deal. There's several things that she overlooks. First of all, she assumes the federal government has the mandate over the utilities. It isn't. It's basically your local utilities, your state utilities, that have to get approval from the utility board from that standpoint. They estimate that it would cost $1 trillion to build all these parks, wind farms and solar parks across the United States. I think that's a very conservative estimate. I think it would be more than that. But more importantly, it does not include the impact of closing the fossil fuel power plants, the coal plants, the natural gas plants, the nuclear plants. It doesn't include the cost to lay the highline wires. My estimate would be it would be $4 or $5 trillion over a 10-year period of time, which would mean drastically higher taxes to help subsidize this, and also drastically higher power costs. You have to realize the power cost that the average we pay is about 12 cents a kilowatt hour. In Europe, because of the way they run a centralized government, it tends to run between 30 to 40 cents per kilowatt hour. So the economics are very different. Now, as far as the other issue I have is Ocasio-Cortez tends to see business as the enemy. I would say if you want to make progress, then you have to include businesses. And what people don't realize is actually businesses are moving faster toward renewables than the utilities. 53% of the wind farms have been built by major corporations like AT&T, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Walmart, General Motors, because they can sign 15, 20-year power purchase agreements for a steady, constant flow of power at a rate of 2.5, 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And then the company that builds the farm goes to the bank, borrows the money, and shows them the power purchase agreement, and they'll build the farm. So these large corporations are moving to renewables because it's for economic reasons. So absolutely, if we want to build these wind farms and solar parks, extend the existing tax credit for renewables, which expires in 2022, and that will continue the push to renewables from an economic reason. More importantly, for the consumer, when you have business involved, you have competition, and when you have competition, you see higher quality products and lower costs.
So oil companies should just stop being resistant, and they should just branch out and have part of them for their oil, what they've done all these decades, and the other part to invest in these renewables.
Well, actually, they have been. They have been. You look at ExxonMobil, you look at Shell, you look at British Petroleum. They're investing heavily into a series of things. One is carbon capture to reduce emissions from that standpoint and storage of that or cleaning it up. The other is battery storage. And you've got companies like BP and Shell that have been buying and building wind farms and solar parks across the U.S. You have one company in Denmark, it used to be Danish Oil and Natural Gas, that basically has sold off all its fossil fuel products completely and have moved in 100% renewable energy. Statoil, the Norwegian company out of Norway, is investing heavily in offshore wind. And they've got a pilot project that they think that with the offshore wind, although they generate more power because wind is stronger offshore, you have to spend more money because of the platform pedestal to put that wind turbine on. But they think they've got a floating wind turbine that can drive the cost down to 3 cents a kilowatt hour, which would, again, drive the cost down and would be a major source of power. So the utilities are in, obviously, renewables. The oil and gas companies aren't oil and gas companies, they're energy companies. And then, of course, you've got the tech companies involved as well. So you've got a huge investment from a lot of different sectors to make renewables cost-effective and better for their customers.
In a country where it is supposed to be we the people, I think it only makes sense for we the people to educate ourselves, and I think your book is going to help with that. I hope everybody reads the book. I hope every congressman reads the book. Maybe you can speak to Congress. Let's see. I found the book on Amazon. Do you have a different website you want to recommend?
Amazon's great. I do have my own webpage where I actually blog on a wide range of energy topics at www.Kerfoot, Kerfoot.com. And I typically blog 5 to 7 times a week on a wide range of energy-related topics. And I wrote the book to sort of to look back on my career in energy. And actually, I started out in university in the 70s when the energy crisis hit, when there was an oil embargo. Mm-hmm. And so I actually went into the oil industry from that standpoint because it was at that time the country was concerned about how do we keep our economy moving, how do we keep cars with fuel in the pipelines and gas in the stations, so people don't have to wait 2 and 3 hours to get up to buy 5 gallons of gas. I'm sure that was before your time.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't before my time. The positive message I take from our conversation today is that there is a hope. There is a hope that we can still have the energy, still have the lifestyle we have, and have clean air and water at the same time. It is possible, but we have to pay attention to people like you. Thank you for doing this. I think you're making the world a better place. Thank you so much.
Very good. Larry and Robin, I certainly appreciate the time, and thank you.
Hey, you're welcome. We'll be right back.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala.
Fox News, I'm Chris Foster. President Trump